Today I speak to Dr. Teri Allendorf, who is the Executive Director at Community Conservation Inc. Dr. Teri is a conservation biologist who has worked on issues of local community and conservation since 1994. She was a member of USAID's Biodiversity team, a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal, and has partnered with NGOs and communities on conservation issues in Nepal, Myanmar, China, and India. In this episode, we talk about how exactly local communities have led the way for conservation with real life examples of some very inspiring conservation stories. We specifically cover the work of Community Conservation Inc. to help conserve golden langurs in Assam, tigers in Nepal, and gorillas in Cameroon. As always, 30% of the revenue from optional paid subscriptions from this episode will be donated to organizations like this. Welcome, Terry, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
What got you interested in conservation?
Well, I grew up out in Montana in the Rocky Mountains, so I've always enjoyed the outdoors and done things outdoors. And then I went to Nepal as a volunteer with the U.S. Peace Corps. And that was in 1991 when community forestry was just beginning. So I got to experience sort of like the environment in a totally different set of mountains in the Himalayas, and understanding how local communities there really interacted with their environment and wanted to conserve their environment, even in, the smallest village in the most remote place. And so that's really what set me on my interest of working as a conservation biologist, but looking from a human dimensions perspective of, how humans interact with their environment and the motivations and perceptions they have toward wildlife and protected areas and forests and things like that.
So, what is community-based conservation and why is it necessary?
So community-based conservation is communities actually doing the conservation of biodiversity. And it's a term that we hear a lot in most conservation organizations. Will talk about community conservation. Often they're talking more about wanting to provide benefits to communities through projects. So maybe like supplementing resources, for like instead of having people extract fuel with it, you provide some other alternative fuel sources. So you provide alternatives to extraction, or it's about like livelihood programs so that people, instead of extracting, can make money from somewhere else and then buy the resources they need. But when we use the term community conservation, we really mean the communities themselves prioritizing their values and motivations in terms of the environment and wildlife and habitats, and making their own choices about what to conserve and how to conserve it. And what, as an organization, what we found is no matter where we've worked, there are people in every community who want to do conservation, right? Who want to conserve their natural resources for a multitude of reasons, right? Just like we recognize in all the academic literature that everyone in a community has a diverse set of motivations too for conserving the environment. So for recreational values, for better soil, for better weather, better climate, they like the intrinsic value of wildlife, right? So all these values exist at any scale, from the smallest village in India or Nepal or wherever in the world, to national levels in terms of our elected politicians. People do value the environment, right? Across the board, in different ways to different extents. But so community conservation for us is really building on that foundation and saying, if we really want to protect the environment and ultimately even avert climate change, that's going to take a lot of ground up conservation of different habitats for biodiversity reasons and for like carbon sequestration. A lot of people doing a lot of conservation. And if we're thinking of communities only as beneficiaries of conservation rather than the active agents doing it, we're really missing the boat and this huge potential of having people involved at every level in conservation. So that is community conservation to us. And that's why it's so important, right? Because we're throwing about statistics like protecting 30% of the planet, 50% of the planet in terms of natural habitats. And that's only going to happen when everyone living in those areas is also having the opportunity to participate and be the conservationists themselves, right? Whether it's just volunteering or actually becoming professionals. Even in Nepal, you've got people in villages getting master's degrees in forestry. And there's no reason why they couldn't be hired at a local level to be the technical experts in their own areas.
So, does community-based conservation work at a large scale?
It does. And I get this question a lot. And I mean, so one way to think about it is communities exist across the large scale, right? So if you have communities everywhere participating in conservation, you're working at a large scale. And the two examples I like to give, which are very different examples, but show the same phenomenon of communities working across a large scale, is community forestry in Nepal, where at this point, after 50 years of practice, community forestry is protecting about 40% of the forests in Nepal. And Nepal has actually doubled its forest cover since communities were able to take control of their forests and manage them. So they've gone from a low in the 70s of 26% forest, when people were predicting through the Himalayan degradation theory that all the forest would be lost by like 2000. They've gone from 26% in a low point up to 46% now. And that is primarily because of communities being involved in conservation of forests. And on the other side, we have Namibia in Africa, which is an example of wildlife conservation by communities across the large scale. So there they have community wildlife conservancies where the communities, again, are managing and getting the benefits from conservation of wildlife in Namibia. And that's across a large scale too. I think, is it like 20 to 30% of their land is protected that way? And so those are examples of large scale success through, national policies that support local communities to actually have like legal ability to manage. And that's kind of what it takes, I think, to get to a large scale.
So why do people participate in community-based conservation?
Yeah, we touched on it earlier, right? In terms of people's motivations and perceptions of the value of the environment. And so people participate because they want their communities to be better places. And so I see a couple of things. Just like probably any of us in our own lives, we meet people who are maybe really focused on biodiversity and conservation. And we also meet people who just want their communities to be better places. And so when we go out to villages and work with people, we run into both kind of like what we call conservation heroes or biodiversity heroes, right? Where some of the people we work with just really enjoy nature and really want to protect it in their own communities for its own sake and for the benefits their communities get. And other people are really interested just in making their communities better places. And they see the role of like a bunch of sectors, right? You've got environment, you've got education, you've got health. And those are people who tend to be involved in a lot of different ways in their community. But those are some of the reasons that people participate in conservation, is because they see the benefits to themselves, their own families, their communities. And like I said, that diversity of values is really amazing. So, I mean, one of the things I love about my job is I get to walk into villages all over the world and have these conversations with people about how they perceive their environment. What are the the benefits? What are the problems? What do they value? How do they feel about the different species that they have in their forests? And also helping them understand it's a great collaborative relationship between conservationists and communities, because they have that foundation of values, which we can build on and increase. And one of the ways we can do that is just through providing a larger context to their biodiversity. So sometimes communities don't know how really rare a species is that they see every day. And they may value it because it is a part of their own natural heritage. You'll hear people talk about, oh, there's fewer of this animal than when I was a kid, and we want to protect it. We don't want it to disappear. We want our children to be able to see it. But they also don't realize how valuable that species might be to the bigger world, right? That species doesn't exist everywhere. Back in the 90s, when I was doing my own PhD research in Nepal, I had a woman, she was telling me how much she enjoyed elephants because she lived near Bardia National Park, and the elephants are there and they would come out and eat the fields, which they don't like, of course. But she also talked about how much she loves seeing the elephants, right? People love the trunks and, the trunk of an elephant is amazing. That's like something everyone everywhere appreciates, right? Elephants are pretty amazing creatures. But when I said, well, I've never seen one in the wild. And she's like, what? You don't have those in the US? And that was, she just didn't even know where elephants existed in the world necessarily. And so while people have this foundation of values that we can build on, there's also so much potential to share more information so they understand the larger context and the real importance of their own habitats and environments that they live next to every day. And, when we live next to something, we kind of take it for granted sometimes, and we all need sort of that bigger perspective.
So what does gender tell us about community-based conservation?
Well, gender can tell us how important it is to have a diversity of people involved. So gender, when we look, a lot of my research has been looking at women's perceptions versus men and their participation in the environment and conservation. And there's so much that can be said here. There's so many differences you can find between men and women for many reasons, both in terms of they may, interact differently with the environment. Women in some contexts are the ones going to the forest more to extract resources like fuel wood. Sometimes they're going less and the men are going more. And so they have different relationships and that will impact their perceptions. But across the research I've done looking at gender, one of the key factors is that women are often just not included. And these lessons can be extended to thinking about, marginalized or the poor households in a community. It can just be harder for many people to participate. You don't have the time. You may not get invited to the meetings. And so in my research, what I found was women often had this, the same values and understanding of the importance of the environment, but they may not have access to the information. So if they had it, they, like in the case of Nepal, they'd actually probably be way more pro-conservation, we would predict. And then in other cases, if they have the same access, they would be equally likely to want to participate in conservation. But we're not always inviting women to meetings in these developing country contexts, right? Where we think, so one grad student I had was actually worked in Malaysia and she was very worried. She's like, I really want to include the women, but I feel like I'll be burdening them with more stuff because, women are already doing so much usually in terms of households and taking care of people and cooking and getting resources. But, it's sort of like you've got to, if you don't ask people, they can't participate, right? So I said, we just have to ask them. We have to give them opportunities and then figure out what they want to do, right? And how they can participate. And so we just asked the women, hey, would you have liked to have learned how to camera trap? Because that was what she'd been doing with the men in the community. And the women were like, yes, we would love to learn how to camera trap. And so we did like an impromptu 2-day camera trapping session with the women and they bring along the children, right? So then the children also see what you're doing. And so, gender tells us that we really need to make sure we're trying to think about how to involve everybody and that we shouldn't make assumptions about who wants to participate or who can participate. But that it's just like education. Everyone should have an opportunity to be educated, male or female. Everyone should have an opportunity to learn about the projects in their communities and the things that they can do to, better improve their own communities, right? And that means giving women access to biodiversity projects and information, just like health or education. So that's an important concept, I think, when we think about biodiversity at the local community level too, is thinking about we think of people as having rights to education, right? And to health, resources. And the same thing I think should be true of conservation and biodiversity. People should have access to be able to participate in conserving their environment and having the knowledge about it also.
So what makes community-based conservation successful and what are some prominent roadblocks to such projects?
Okay, so what makes it successful and what are the roadblocks? Well, what makes it successful, again, is that there are always people in everywhere that want to participate in conservation, right? And providing them the opportunities, which they may not always have at a local level, is really important. So they're successful when people have the opportunity to participate. And as a community, have a process of both governance and management for them to help make decisions about what's going on in their communities and in the habitats around their communities. And so success is them having that opportunity, but then also having the support. Like I mentioned, whether it's government policies that actually kind of make it legal, make it possible for them to do that management, and to have the support to create the right local institutions or support traditional institutions that do conservation in their own communities. Those are all things that make it successful, and giving people the capacity in terms of monitoring their own species. So we have examples of different projects where what people want is to be able to understand more. Like in Cameroon, we support a community forestry. They're already a community forest, but they want to know more about wildlife because they've been hunting using the traditional methods, and the area isn't really large enough to support them just hunting without more management and knowing what's sustainable. And so they want help learning to monitor what wildlife they have and how to more sustainably hunt. And in a lot of areas, that monitoring piece is really important, right? And it should be happening again by the communities themselves in partnership with NGOs or government, right? We call that, Eleanor Ostrom, the Nobel Prize winner in economics, called it polycentric governance. You need multiple loci of power and capacity to get conservation going and successful, but the communities really need to be participating at all levels and being the primary drivers and understanding of what's happening in their area. So that's what makes it successful. And then some roadblocks are that not every country and place has support from the government to do it. And then we can see communities attempting to do it or being willing to do it, but not really having the structures and institutions to support them doing it. So like in India with one of our projects that we had supported initially, and it was very successful, the Kakarvijana Reserve Forest, the communities just lost control over that forest because they decided to turn it into a national park. They were so successful, the communities, over the last 20 some years at conserving the golden langur, that the government decided this should be a national park. And what that means for community involvement and participation probably is not going to be positive, right? It's now going to be run by the government. And so those are some of the obstacles. So first, communities have to actually get control or some kind of form of management over an area. So like in Myanmar, they have community forestry, but the government doesn't necessarily support it, even though it's in the policies. And so we've been working with some communities that for 10 or 15 years have been trying to get certified as a community forest. And this was a story in Nepal for a really long time too, that even though in the 70s community forests started, and then in the 80s, early 90s, it became part of national policy, a lot of individuals in the forest department maybe still didn't want to turn over power to communities. So a huge roadblock at all different levels, at all different stages, is communities just getting the support from the government policies to actually do the conservation themselves. And then even, like we saw in India over the long term, sometimes then that might even get taken away. So it's a constant sort of balance to think about, communities and how they can maintain control over the places that they're trying to conserve.
So since you're talking about the Golden Langur project, since you mentioned about the Golden Langur project, why don't you talk a bit more about it and give us the history of the project?
Yeah, so in that case, in that reserve forest in Assam, our founder, Rob Horwich, so I visited the project site once about a year and a half ago now, or last fall. But our founder back in the 90s first started working in that area around the Manas Biosphere Reserve to conserve the golden langur. He was a primatologist, and so that's one reason he was focused on the golden langur in that area. And so the NGO he was working with actually took him to this one spot called Kakarvijana. And what Rob said he saw was monkeys, golden langurs on the ground. Like there was no forest. It was so degraded that they're actually on the ground. And he said, there's no way. This forest is way too far gone. Let's not waste our time. Let's continue working over near Manas. And the NGO said, no, we know these communities and we know that they are committed to this and we want to work with them. And Rob said, okay, you do what you want to do. And he came back a couple of years later, or, a handful of years later, and he was just amazed at how the forest had come back. And so this is a lesson around the world too, right? If we keep, cows and goats and grazers out of forests and we let them sort of even restore naturally, they can really regenerate fast and come back. And it was just a success story from then on out that the forest came back, the langurs were conserved, the numbers were growing, the community was monitoring it. So it's a success story all around. And of course, I wasn't there for all of it and their ins and outs, and I'm sure there's a lot more detail to that story. But overall, you can look it up online, right? There's so many articles about the success of this story because the communities themselves were motivated and really driving the process.
I think Manas as a whole is one of the best examples of community-based conservation. After the insurgency ended in the early 2000s, the Portland tried to go conservation of the national park, and since then they've reintroduced rhinos and their population has grown. The pygmy hog has been reintroduced, and it is one of the best national parks of India.
Yeah, it is amazing. And actually, I'll just point, and also when I was there last fall, another issue that happened, another thing that happened that I haven't kept up with it, would be interesting to know more about, was like the very time I was there, the government had decided to make all those around Manas, all those volunteer protection forces, part of like the government staff, from my understanding. And it was sort of happening as I was there. So it wasn't totally clear to me. But so basically the government was supporting those volunteers and now they were going to become, staff of some sort. But then the question is that really empower them more to do conservation, or now are they government staff and not actually working as like a community conservation group anymore, right? And at the time it looked like it actually kind of, limited the power of the community, because all those people that have been volunteering as community protection forces are now government employees in a way, right? So that was all something too that I would like to follow up on and understand better what's happened since. But it kind of goes to show obstacles, right? Like how there's no staticness to conservation, right? It's a constant sort of flow, ebb and flow of things that are happening.
I think that could be something which is a consequence of the broader political situation in the area, where after insurgency ended, the borderland agreement was formed, and basically the borderland community are the government of the region. So I think it could be something of that sort.
Yeah. So I should learn more about it. It's hard. We have projects all over the world, right?
Yeah.
And some of them, like this one, happened before I came on as director about 4 or 5 years ago, and I'd helped our director publish on it when I was on the board for community conservation. But yeah, the history of each of the projects we've worked on it's just amazing to try and understand in more detail, because there's these general contexts that apply, but then the individual stories of each site are just fascinating.
So let's take a step back and talk about community conservation as an organization. How did it come into being? And talk about the first project on the Community Baboon Sanctuary.
Yeah, great. So our founder was Rob Horwich, as I mentioned. And yeah, it all started with him. He was like an ethologist. He was a behaviorist. And then he was very interested in primates. And he went to Belize in the early 1980s. He kind of worked in different places in the world for his own research and PhD, like in India and some other sites. But he ended up in Belize in the early 1990s. And someone had said, if you want to see howler monkeys, so in Belize, they call the black howler monkey a baboon. They think because of, the African migration, they were using the word baboon. And so he'd like, go to this tree. Someone said, so you need to go to this river and you go to this bridge and there'll be this tree and then you'll see black howlers in there. And he did that. He just sort of got a ride, showed up at this place, at this river where there was a ferry at the time. No bridge, actually, I think. And he saw the black howler monkeys. And then he just started walking around talking to the communities, because all that land, there's a lot of like riparian forests left along the river, which is where the baboons, the black howlers, were living. And he started talking to people about, well, how many do you have? And because those are an endangered species. And I started working with the private landowners along that river. And they were he started working with he had a local like counterpart who, as he explained what he wanted to do, they became very interested. Although initially they came out with a shotgun when they saw him wandering around. And I guess his main partner was like, and the guy who ended up being his main partner was like, isn't it kind of early for Santa Claus? Because our founder kind of had like a white beard and he looked a little bit like Santa Claus. Like, what are you doing here? Because people coming onto your land, the land titles were a little bit not secure. And so people would come in and buy land and then, dispossess people of their land. And, Rob was like, no, I'm interested in the black howler monkeys. And they ended up actually having over 100 landowners sign pledges to keep, some basic conservation measures, like keep the riparian forest, keep the forests along the river, and do some other basic things. And they started a whole NGO, and they created the Community Baboon Sanctuary to protect this whole area and to involve the landowners in the conservation of the monkey. And they came back. They're doing really well. The population's been increasing. Again, it's a long story. So they had like a board that was mainly made up of men initially in the 90s. And then in about 2000, the men maybe started losing interest, or other things were getting their attention, because, NGOs ebb and flow, right? Institutions and ebb and flow. And then the wife of the main person who started it with Rob said, well, wait a minute, maybe the women should take this over and make sure this keeps going. And so now the board is all led by women. Jessie Young now is the board president, and the wife that I was talking about. And so they've taken it over, and they've really expanded it into so many ways, and not just conserving the howler monkey, but doing a lot of education projects for the kids, having summer camps. They have a museum, and they do a lot of tourism in the area, because they have one small forest that's very easy, that the monkeys are pretty habituated, so they can take tourists in pretty easily. But again, they've got this problem with Belize. The big cruise ships are now driving a lot of the tourism, and big cruise ships don't necessarily want to come to a small site like this. And so, them trying to, in that case, it's an area with a lot of tourism, and they've got to figure out the balance of tourism. And again, always trying to find funds, right? So they're this amazingly successful project, and Jessie and the organization has won awards, but it's not like the pressure, of funding or activities or finding people to volunteer ever goes away, right? You're always having to do those things. And I think that's one interesting thing about community conservation is like, we can create these sustainable institutions and we can say we've had success in supporting them and they're still going. But, there's still always so much work to do to protect these areas and into perpetuity and adapt to the changing environment, right? Like climate change and what that can do to habitat for species that you're trying to protect. But we have now taken 2 trips with supporters of one trip. I've been there twice. We've taken one group of community conservation supporters to sort of see our first project and how it's going. And what our founder did at community conservation with his partners at the Baboon Sanctuary with his partners expanded to a lot of other areas in Belize, which is another measure of success. Our founder called it conservation contagion and we've seen this happen with our partner in Peru too. When conservation starts in one community, and we saw this in Assam also, when one community starts a project and gets it going for biodiversity, and it probably works for health or other things too, right? Other communities look and they say, hey, that's something we want to get involved in. We would like to have that success too. And you can sort of see this conservation contagion spreading, through communities from the different sites where good programs get started and they're modeling, communities are modeling conservation projects for other communities. And so that's another important measure of success, right? Not just the biodiversity within a community and how they're managing it, but then whether you can spread that across the landscape, which gets at your earlier question about does it work at scale? And so even maybe without government policies, it can start to work at scale just because communities will share with each other. But to make it sustainable, it really needs those supportive policies also.
So talk about the 9 stages of community-based conservation.
Yeah. And the 9 stages are sort of a loose concept, I would say, but not that loose. So it's interesting. Our founder sort of described these 9 stages and, maybe you could make it into 5 or you could make it into 10 or whatever. But basically it's the process that he found in every community he walked into that sort of ended up happening over time, he realized with his approach. And so we actually had one of our partner in Cameroon has said he was always actually really surprised because Rob would come in and he'd be so rigid about the way to do community conservation. And rigid seems like the opposite of what you would expect from a process that is, fluid and flexible and participatory. But what Rob meant by rigid is the sort of 9 stages where as an outsider coming in to do conservation, first you just have to sort of get to know the community. You have to meet the community and get to know them, right? And as you do that and you explain why you're there and you find out if they're interested in doing conservation, because, if a community, for whatever reason, it's not the right time or place and they don't have the capacity to be thinking about conservation at that point in time, maybe, that's not the place to work, right? So there can be people who are interested, but it may just not be the right time. But anyway, you have to get to know them, find out who's in the community, find out what they're already doing, what their interests are. In Peru, for example, our partners found out that in a lot of cases, communities were already doing their own conservation, like we said, but they did want support and they needed help getting things sort of formalized. So anyway, you have to sort of get to know the community, find out what their interests are. And then what would happen is trying to provide them more information, like we just talked about the context of their biodiversity, the global context, right? So you sort of move through getting to know them, seeing who's interested. From those who are interested, leaders or champions of your project will start to emerge, and then they'll be the main people who sort of work to organize or talk to the rest of the community, right? So you've got to find good partners in the community who are sharing your goals and values, and you're working together and collaborating, right? And then providing people with the information or the capacity to sort of put a project into place, right? The institutions, the management, the decision-making, the participatory decision-making amongst people in the community. And so you sort of move through those stages of getting to know them, providing information, finding common ground, finding the conservation leaders who will help drive the program, the project in the community, into actually figuring out, well, what are our goals going to be? Like, what is the actual management we need to do? How are we going to achieve the conservation goals the community has set? And then from there, once you sort of get a project going and it's formalized within the community, then what you begin to see is you have both the horizontal spread to other communities, but also a vertical spread in that, as I sort of mentioned in terms of polycentric governance, the community alone can't do it, right? So you need to always be thinking about who are the other stakeholders and people who can participate and be supportive. And that can be, other government offices, other NGOs, you have to start looking at the other people who are involved in the area, other sectors, health, education. So a nice example of vertical linkages is actually with our partners in Myanmar, Friends of Wildlife, who I've worked with since 1999, beginning sort of working with them to start thinking about communities around protected areas and how you work with them. And so they've been doing it for a long time there now, even though it's not a country where it's easy to do. And the main founder of Friends of Wildlife, U Miao, he was so good at this vertical linkage because he recognized that you can't start a project with a community without everyone else in the area knowing what you're doing. He would invite every NGO, every government representative that he could bring to the table so that they knew what the community was trying to achieve and how they were trying to achieve it. Because you never know at what point in time, that particular stakeholder or institution can be the one who supports the community if they know what's happening. They can also be the ones who undercut it if they don't know what's happening and what the community is trying to achieve, right? So it's really, really important in the final sort of, initial process of having all those supporters, trying to form, more supporters that are external to the community and can support them. And of course, it's an iterative process, right? So like I keep saying, there's this, once a project gets started, maybe if you're lucky, within 5 or 10 years, you get something really sustainable and really good in the community. But then they also have to be able to keep it going over decades, right? And have the support from all the different stakeholders in the area. And so hopefully that's kind of in a nutshell what the process looks like.
What are some of the other key projects which your organization is involved with?
So I think I've tried to mention examples of them. Like in Peru, our partner there is Neotropical Primate Conservation, and they work to form, in Peru, they're called conservation concessions that communities can actually get for themselves. And so there, what the partner does is provide a lot of support because so the government policies require quite a bit of footwork by the communities, which they don't necessarily have the capacity to do in terms of to get the area registered. They have to do a biodiversity survey. They have to do a socioeconomic survey. They have to have a budget plan, a financial management plan. And so they really need the support of NGOs to do that. The policy, the way it's written, just sort of requires that. And those things have to be updated every once in a while. And so our partner plays a key role in providing that, both trying to build the capacity of the communities, but providing them with the help to actually get those concessions in place. So that's our project in Peru. And in Cameroon, we have our partner there is community-based biosynergy management. And they are working in a couple of sites in Cameroon right now. They're a pretty new organization, even though the founder, Dennis Ndelo, has worked there for a long time. He's Cameroonian and has worked for a long time in conservation of the great apes there. And a couple of years ago, we held, another key part of the process, which I didn't mention, is not always just working with one community, but actually holding quite large meetings in an area that you might want to work in, where you see the potential for communities to really do great conservation work. Because if you hold a big meeting, so like our founder did this in Peru with our partner, and then we did it a couple of years ago in Cameroon, where you have larger meetings where you invite a lot of stakeholders and you're like, we're here to try and support communities to do conservation. And if you're interested, come to us and, we'll work out how we can support you. Rather than us always going to communities, there are communities who just want to do it and they'll come to you and ask for help. And that's a great way to start projects. And so in Cameroon, we had an initial meeting a couple of years ago that Dennis organized with key stakeholders, because in Cameroon, there is community forestry, but it's really focused on high value timber, mainly in like the southeast area of Cameroon. And what he saw was that sort of this full diversity of values that communities have towards their forests and habitats was being lost because of the focus on the high value timber. So we had a meeting to sort of discuss some of these issues. And in that meeting, there were two community leaders who had been invited, and we started projects in both those areas. One was sort of up in the Northwest Plateau area where the community leaders said, we have chimpanzees in our forest. And Dennis was like, you do? We didn't know there were chimpanzees up there. And so we went up to check out the site, and what was happening was the leader, the chief, was worried about the chimps because they used to come really close to the village, and they could hear that they were not coming as close, and the forest is being degraded for various different reasons, both for, the local community, that behaviors they had, but also Nigerians coming over the border were contributing to the forest degradation. And you hear this in a lot of communities. One of the motivating factors will be, we heard this species or we had this species when I was younger, but we're losing it now and we would like to protect it. We don't want to lose that from our landscape. And in this case, it was the chimpanzee. And so Dennis has started working with them and his organization to do surveys of the chimpanzees to see if they're connected to larger populations of chimpanzees and to see what, the threats are and how we can mitigate those with the community. And they're doing a lot of sort of reforestation and also just trying to figure out how many chimps there are and where they are. And then the other site in Cameroon is a huge contrast because it's a well-established community forest, which I mentioned earlier, where the community has said, okay, we're doing forestry. We've got that in place. That's great. But we want to think more about the wildlife in our forests. And so, like I said, we're helping them create and actually it's a village, it's a monitoring system across a number of villages who have similar concerns that's just being started now in the last couple of years. In Nepal, we've been working in a similar fashion to Cameroon with that last site, where Nepal community forestry is so successful, but people aren't necessarily thinking about wildlife in their forests because, again, community forestry has been focused on timber, if there is timber, or non-timber forest products for the local communities, or fuel wood or other natural resources. And people are well aware of the ecosystem services from the forest, like water and better fertilized soil and things, but they're not really thinking as much about wildlife. That's not incorporated into community forestry. And so we've been camera trapping with communities in the southeast of Nepal, which is one of the more neglected regions in terms of wildlife, and trying to give communities the knowledge and capacity to start thinking about how do we incorporate species, wildlife conservation into our management plans. And in that area, you actually do have elephants roaming across the landscape. So they do have some serious wildlife issues that need to be managed. And monkeys are also increasing. So monkey crop, depredation is also a problem. Yeah, so that's Nepal. And then in Myanmar, it's a little bit of a contrasting project because in Myanmar, our partner has been working to do management plans for a lot of protected areas over the last decade or so. And because of the initial work I did with them and the focus on communities earlier than that, they really incorporated a lot of community surveys into their protected area management research that they do to create the management plans. And they sort of know who are the key people around the protected areas, the local conservation champions. And then they invite people from a number of protected areas up to a training site that they've established in the Indaji Biosphere Reserve up north. And unfortunately, because of the situation in Myanmar, we haven't been able to do this for a few years now. But they would invite, 15 to 25 local protected area community leaders to come up and learn how to do community conservation and trying from the ground up but kind of at a national scale to get communities thinking about what can they do for conservation? How can they support it? And they also more recently had from the northwest of Myanmar had Naga communities like Naga, same as across the border in India, asking for help to help protect wetlands and wildlife species that they have because they are really motivated to protect, but they need, again, the support and some of the knowledge to know how to monitor and actually understand what the threats are to their habitats and wildlife. So that's Myanmar. And then I also mentioned Malaysia, where we're working with a couple of longhouses right now around a protected area and trying to, and Malaysia is kind of hard. We hear a lot about indigenous rights in Malaysia, but then on the ground, the actual tenure that communities have over their land, it's not clear what powers they actually have to manage or make decisions. So that's a little bit of a harder project to grasp. What can we be helping communities to do? They have rights to the land, but then how do they manage it? So how do they manage it? We're working now on reforesting some of the rubber plantations that they've had to see if we can bring that back, help them bring that back for wildlife. And so that's kind of an interesting ongoing project. And then the topography, because we work in Sarawak, in Borneo, the topography of Malaysia with the hills, you can't, like we talk, how can we have a bigger meeting and bring communities together? And that can be really difficult just because the topography and getting around that landscape is really hard to figure out how to scale up across communities. So that's sort of another contrasting project to some of the other sites. And I think that covers most of the main ongoing ones right now. And we have a lot of historical ones too that we've sort of, have now left behind and they're ongoing on their own.
So my final question is, how can individuals contribute to your organization?
Well, of course, you can go to our website, communityconservation.org. You can support us. You can become involved. We have different ways you can become involved. So I highly encourage people to go take a look at the website. We have some resources for understanding community conservation better. We also have an annual event called the Pedal, Paddle, and Plod that you can participate in. And then just you are a community person, right? All of us live in communities and belong to communities. And I would highly encourage people to look around and just think about, well, in my own landscape around me, how do I feel about the biodiversity? What's happening? How is my community involved? So I live in we call them villages in Wisconsin, in the US, because that's where I'm based out of Mazomanie, Wisconsin. And then community conservation is based out of Barocco, which is another small area. And right around my village, there are 2 areas that I would consider community conserved areas. There's probably more once you understand the history of how different parks and sanctuaries get protected. There's often a community component. And we actually have a remnant prairie up on a bluff in my village that was sort of under the radar. And local community members were protecting it and managing it for the rare and endangered species of prairie that are up there. And then the village board got some kind of a grant and they wanted to turn it into a park with pavement. And the people protecting it were like, no, do you know what we have up there? And so they really had to explain to the village board, who didn't even know this was one of our resources, this, endangered habitat, what's in that habitat. And then the Department of Natural Resources had to step in and actually say, and you can't develop this site as a park just legally because there is an endangered species. I think it was of a lizard on that area, which kind of gets at, again, that's an example of the polycentric governance I was talking about, where it can take different stakeholders, right? The volunteers who are protecting it, the Department of Natural Resources, a government agency, and then the board. We had to get the board on board because no one had ever really highlighted to the board this resource that we had. So they had to gain knowledge about what it meant and what its value was. And so in that case, like everyone in your own communities, you can kind of look around and say, what biodiversity do I have? And are there groups I can participate with, or, initiatives I can or help to organize or volunteer for to protect the habitat right around my own area where I live? And so, the opportunities to participate in community conservation are endless. And it's really, I know it can be it's easy to think about protecting wildlife in your own backyard and habitats and species if you're someone who enjoys getting outside and enjoying nature. And then making the leap to realizing that, okay, this community in Cameroon or this community in Nepal looks really different from mine, right? And we often think that they look, to our eye, they look poor, they look like they have other priorities in their environment. But no, really the foundational values that you feel when you walk outside and enjoy where you are, those are the same things that they're valuing when they walk outside. And there is a different context. There are differences, but those basic shared values, I think, are the same. And so when, whether you're doing your own conservation in your own backyard or supporting an organization like ours that is really, truly trying to help communities have, the opportunity to conserve their environment, those are really the same, 2 sides of the same coin. And it is really important for us all to do. And that in turn is going to help protect our globe, right? And it's going to mitigate climate change, which is a huge thing that we're all facing in the future. And part of that mitigation is going to have to be supporting communities no matter where they're at to protect their own habitats and wildlife around them.
So that is the final question I had for you today. Thank you so much for taking time out for this.
If you made it till the end of this podcast, feel free to leave your thoughts on the topic and do not forget to share and subscribe. Before we end the podcast, I would like to share another list of conservation books which I highly recommend. This time it is on the topic of rewilding and ecological restoration. The first is a seminal book called Rewilding, The Radical New Science of Ecological Recovery by Glenn Blight and Paul Chipson, which covers the restoration of ecological processes and ecosystem functioning by the reintroduction of species, especially megaherbivores. A less technical and science-heavy book is Rewilding Africa, The Restoration of Wilderness on a War-Ravaged Continent, which explores conservation across various heavily militarized landscapes. And the final book is Wilder, How Rewilding is Transformating Conservation and Changing the World. This covers the rewilding of various charismatic species ranging from pumas in the US to the Arabian oryx in the Middle East and giant tortoise. And with that, I would like to end this episode of the Think Wildlife podcast. See you next Monday.